Something nobody is telling you plainly, and that's what makes this so important, is that right now, while mainstream media cycles through headlines about peace talks and ceasefire proposals, Russia is quietly advancing one of the most consequential nuclear modernization programs in modern history. The RS-28 Sarmat, what Western analysts call Satan-2, is not just a missile. It is a 208-ton message, a 35-meter-long ultimatum buried in a silo pointed at the architecture of global power itself. And if you think this is just another piece of Cold War theater dusted off for the nightly news, you need to look much more carefully at what's actually happening here, because the implications run far deeper than most people are willing to say out loud. Let's start with the facts as they actually stand. As recently as October 2025, Putin himself admitted to wounded soldiers at a Moscow military hospital that the Sarmat is not yet deployed, but it will be soon. He called it something the world has never seen before. Now on the surface, that sounds like a leader reassuring his own men, but look at the context. This is a man who, back in September 2023, had his own space agency chief declare the Sarmat had assumed combat alert posture, a claim that was later contradicted by his own words 2 years later. So what does this contradiction actually tell us? It tells us that the information war around this weapon is as important to Moscow as the weapon itself. The Sarmat is being used as a strategic signal whether or not the missile can reliably leave its silo. And that right there is the part that deserves serious, sober attention. Since its 2022 flight test, the RS-28 Sarmat has experienced a series of failed tests, including a catastrophic failure in September 2024 that analysts believe obliterated the launch silo itself, creating a smoldering 200-foot wide crater in northern Russia and wiping out a wide swath of Russian forest. That is not a minor technical glitch. That is a multi-billion-dollar program quite literally blowing up in the Kremlin's face. And yet, here is the critical thing. The narrative did not stop. Moscow kept talking about deployment. Putin kept making promises about an invincible weapon. The psychological operation around the Sarmat continued even as the physical program was stumbling badly. This is something that many Western analysts either miss entirely or deliberately understate. The Sarmat is operating on two levels simultaneously. On one level, it is a real weapon system with genuine destructive potential if and when it becomes reliably operational. The missile is designed to carry up to 15 to 16 multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs, and is compatible with advanced hypersonic glide vehicles like the Avangard. It employs a fractional orbital bombardment system mode, allowing it to fly trajectories over the South Pole, which dramatically reduces warning time for adversaries and allows it to bypass missile defense systems concentrated in northern regions. Think about what that means for a moment. A missile that can come at the United States from the south, from a direction that current defense infrastructure is not optimized to track. That is not just a weapons upgrade. That is a fundamental rethinking of deterrence geometry. On the second level, the Sarmat functions as pure strategic communication. It says to Washington, to Brussels, to every NATO capital, think very carefully about how far you push this. Putin himself stated in 2023 that the Sarmat would make Russia's enemies think twice and explicitly frame the missile as Russia's response to what Moscow calls aggressive Western posturing toward Russia. Whether you believe that framing or not is almost beside the point. What matters is that this is how the Kremlin thinks about this weapon. It is not primarily a battlefield tool in the conventional sense. It is a political instrument. It is deterrence doctrine made concrete and placed in a silo. Now let's be very honest about where all of this sits within the broader picture of what's happening between Russia and the West right now. As of spring 2025, Russia continued to reject calls for an unconditional ceasefire in Ukraine and escalated missile and drone attacks dramatically through the summer months. Putin declared in June 2025 that all of Ukraine effectively belongs to Russia and that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. Those are not the words of a man preparing to compromise. Those are the words of someone who believes, at least publicly, that time is on his side. And when a leader makes those kinds of statements while also hinting at the imminent deployment of the world's most powerful intercontinental ballistic missile, the combination deserves far more careful analysis than it typically receives. The United States presented what it described as its final peace proposal in April 2025, one that would acknowledge Crimea as part of Russia and recognize Russian-occupied territory in Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia as de facto Russian, while barring Ukraine from joining NATO. Read that again slowly. The United States, the country that spent decades insisting on a rules-based international order and the sovereignty of nations, effectively offered to ratify the largest land grab in Europe since World War II, and Russia still said no. That tells you something fundamental about what the Kremlin is actually after, and it has very little to do with security guarantees for Russia's border. When someone offers you everything they said they wanted and you still say no, you are either after something much larger or you have calculated that continuing the conflict serves your interests better than any deal currently on the table. This is where the Sarmat comes back into the conversation in a very direct way, because what Russia understands and what much of the American public is not being told clearly enough is that nuclear posturing works. It has worked throughout this conflict. Vladimir Putin has frequently referenced nuclear options in the context of Ukraine, using it as a form of psychological warfare aimed at keeping NATO off balance through intimidation and the implied threat of nuclear escalation. Every time a Western government considered sending a particular weapon system to Ukraine, long-range missiles, fighter jets, advanced air defense, the first question in every cabinet room was always some version of how will Moscow react and could this go nuclear? That fear, whether justified or exaggerated, shaped Western policy at every turn. The Sarmat is the physical embodiment of that fear. It is the ultimate insurance policy for the Kremlin's adventurism. And here is the uncomfortable truth that serious geopolitical analysts have to sit with. A nuclear-armed state that is willing to use the threat of escalation as a routine diplomatic tool has already achieved a form of strategic superiority that has nothing to do with battlefield outcomes. Russia has been losing men at staggering rates in Ukraine. By late February 2026, estimates from a highly informed former senior Western official put Russian military casualties at approximately 1 million killed and wounded since the start of the full-scale invasion. 1 million. The Soviet Union lost around 15,000 soldiers in a decade in Afghanistan, and that conflict hollowed out the Soviet system from the inside. Russia has now absorbed a casualty figure that dwarfs that in a fraction of the time, and the war continues. How is that possible? Part of the answer is political repression and information control inside Russia. Part of it is the genuine ideological mobilization of Russian nationalism. But a significant part of the answer is nuclear deterrence. Because NATO, for all its combined military and economic power, will not directly intervene in Ukraine so long as Russia carries a credible nuclear threat, and the Sarmat, credible or not in its current technical state, keeps that threat alive in the minds of Western decision makers. Now think about what it means that this missile is being positioned near the Ukraine theater in terms of the overall strategic message. From Moscow's perspective, the Sarmat deployment signals resilience in the face of sanctions and the attrition of conventional forces. It reaffirms the Kremlin's message of credible large-scale retaliation and escalation dominance, especially in the context of the Ukraine conflict and expanded NATO activity. In other words, Russia is saying, we may be bleeding on the battlefield. Our economy may be under enormous strain. Our most advanced missile may have blown up its own silo, but we still hold the ultimate card. We are still a nuclear superpower, and you will treat us accordingly. That is a message directed not just at Washington, but at the entire global order. At China, which is watching carefully how the West responds to nuclear coercion and drawing lessons for its own Taiwan calculus. At countries across the global South, which are increasingly skeptical of the Western-led order and watching to see whether raw power or principles actually determine outcomes in international affairs. At smaller nations everywhere, which are quietly calculating whether nuclear weapons are the only true guarantor of sovereignty in a world where the rules-based order seems to bend whenever a nuclear-armed state decides to ignore it. The failed tests of the Sarmat do matter, and they should not be minimized. The catastrophic September 2024 test failure significantly undermines Russia's ability to project credible nuclear threats as a means of deterrence and coercion, and raises real questions about the overall readiness and reliability of Russia's strategic nuclear forces. That is a legitimate and important point. But here is where analytical honesty requires acknowledging something uncomfortable. A weapon does not have to be perfectly reliable to be strategically effective. The United States does not know with certainty that any given Sarmat would fail. Moscow does not need the missile to work every time. It needs the West to be uncertain about whether it would work when it matters. And that uncertainty by itself is doing enormous geopolitical work right now. Through late 2025 and into 2026, Russia continued nuclear saber-rattling alongside battlefield operations, including publicizing tests of the nuclear-powered Burevestnik missile and the Poseidon unmanned underwater vehicle, with Kremlin officials openly discussing the devastating nuclear effects these systems could generate. This is a coordinated communication strategy. The Sarmat is not standing alone. It is the centerpiece of a broader nuclear signaling campaign designed to make Western audiences feel that any serious confrontation with Russia risks crossing a threshold from which there is no return. What America needs to understand is that we are living through one of the most significant restructurings of global power since the end of the Cold War. The post-1991 world, in which American power was so overwhelming that no state dared to directly challenge the United States militarily, is over. It has been over for some time, but the Ukraine war has made that reality undeniable. We are now in a world where a second-tier military power, one whose conventional forces have suffered catastrophic losses, can still paralyze the most powerful military alliance in human history through the strategic deployment of nuclear ambiguity. The Sarmat, even half operational, even still failing tests, is central to that new reality. For American strategic planners who are in the midst of their own domestic ICBM replacement program, a program already facing significant cost overruns and schedule delays, the Sarmat deployment presents a visible reminder that Moscow is moving ahead with advanced capabilities even as American programs stumble. There is something deeply sobering about that comparison. The United States, with the world's largest defense budget, is struggling to modernize its own land-based nuclear forces on time and on budget. Russia, under the most severe economic sanctions in modern history, is still, however imperfectly and however belatedly, pushing its own next-generation ICBM toward operational status. As of mid-April 2026, Russia controls roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea and occupied portions of the Donbass, while the front line remains largely frozen with grinding attrition on both sides. The war is not ending. The Sarmat is still not fully deployed. And yet the world is more nuclear conscious, more strategically unstable, and more genuinely uncertain about the future than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. That is the real story here, not just whether this specific missile works or doesn't work, but what it represents about where we are and where we are going. A world in which nuclear weapons are once again the primary language of great power politics. A world in which the rules that governed international behavior for decades are being rewritten in real time, not in committee rooms or treaty negotiations, but on battlefields and in missile silos. And a world in which the decisions made in the next several years about deterrence, about escalation, about what lines exist and who enforces them, will shape the security landscape for every American alive today and every generation that follows.